recent as 1977, H.R. Giger did a very powerful and haunting version of it. So it's something that's just haunted artists over and over and over again, which brings us to Dalí's very specific Boclean images. And there's 3 of these that I have to share. These are the Boclean variations, I guess. This first one is a bit of a surprise. It's the real painting of the Isle of the Dead by Arnold Boclean at the hour of the Angelus. So Dalí was becoming obsessed by the Angelus. He was totally obsessed by Boclean. He was seeing these paintings as occupying the same space. And in this painting that's in Germany, Dalí has painted what? It's a beachfront, very curiously golden water over here. There's a cup on a small block, sort of like coming out of Picasso's paintings. There is something which I assume to be coffee or liquid, maybe tea, that has become a vertical bone or strand coming out of the cup. And then just like in the Persistence of Memory, there's a step in the middle of the beach. So it's all very strange and all very, odd, but it's not menacing in the way that we saw before. We don't think of this being a ghostly painting as much as it's just really very curious one. Then we get to the next painting in 1934. This is the west side of the Isle of the Dead, reconstructed compulsive image after Boclean. And so here he's very specifically thinking, what is the Isle of the Dead? What do we find there? And one of the things that Dalí makes sure we find there is this very creepy apparition, this ghost-like figure under these sheets that is contorting and doing strange things, and we don't know quite what's happening, but it is very sinister and very scary. And then we go to the other one, the companion, Central Courtyard from the Isle of the Dead, reconstructed obsession after Boclean. And this one's a little bit harder to see, but the detail clearly has one of these kind of skeletal creatures made up of different parts, has a few beans up here on the top, bean hanging here, bits of raw meat, and then what appears to be a different kind of skeletal leg supporting the structure. So very sinister, very creepy, and totally delivering on the idea of the macabre and spookiness. Which brings us to Dalí himself. Dalí wrote this article, and this is what I'm going to be spending the next part talking about, trying to separate 2 types of ghosts. And for the article, he hired his friend Man Ray to do a couple photographs of him. So this is Dalí on his beach in Port Legat as a ghost. He's shrouded in different types of sheets. He's balancing curious things on his head. He has become both, what we'll discover, both a phantom, and he also has a spectral quality to his presentation, which both are very strange ideas right away. But the article was called The New Colors of Spectral Sex Appeal. And so the idea is that there are 2 types of ghosts. One of them is a little bit sexier, and that's going to dominate Dalí's paintings moving forward. So he's preparing us for this. This is the article. It was published in Minotaur in 1934. You can see a reference to a familiar figure down here. This is Dalí's nanny, Lucia, who's on the beach. And then you can see the one photo and then a different photo, and there's a couple more photos that were included. And also a reference to Dalí as a little in his sailor suit next to his nanny. And so this is where Dalí tries to define for us 2 very different kinds of specters that both appear in his paintings. One is a phantom and the other is a specter. These are 2 types of ghosts. This would be the contrast, sort of the nanny, nursemaid, sort of bulging, puffy, fleshy kind of creature, which Dalí sees as one type of ghost. And then the other one would be this very strange and very sinister skull that seems to be working very hard on the piano, that has become sliced-like and razor-ish and sharp-edged and without meat. So 2 very different types of figures, probably inspired by Picasso. And there's a really interesting article about Dalí and Picasso, comparing them, by a woman who presented at one of our former conferences during the Picasso show, a woman named Astrid Rufa. And she points this out, that in Picasso there's also this contrast between the very fleshy, very bulbous, very, kind of large woman who becomes the mother early on, kind of Rubenesque, transitioning over to the skeletal insectoid kind of female figure on the beach in the 1930s. And that this was kind of a powerful contrast that certainly seems to go along with Dalí's contrasting of these two forms. So I'm going to go through just a couple of the ways that Dalí defines these two figures to try to understand it a little bit better. We'll see if it works. There are some very strange ideas. A phantom, thinking of the nursemaid, contours that accentuate volume. So plastering cotton is what Dalí thinks about when he thinks of this kind of accentuated form. In contrast, a specter, that skeletal kind of structure, is rays that shred contours. So if the one has a volume contour, this has almost no contour. It's stripped apart. It's like asbestos or silk. It's a much more sharp and harsh type of form. Phantoms are about height and immobility, so they're kind of stuck where they are. Enveloped insinuation is the term that Dalí uses, which is not really all that helpful. Contrasted with specters, which are speed and instantaneity, or blazing manifestations. So immobility versus kind of speed. That's, I think, the contrast there. Sort of a planted nature versus something that's constantly in motion. Another series, phantoms are verticals, where specters are diagonals. So something that's planted, solid, compared to like a diagonal moving through space. An elevator versus a staircase banister. Not so sure how helpful that one is. And curves versus ridges. And that sort of makes sense. Curves are softer, more fluid. A ridge would be sharp. You could get cut on it. So that helps a little bit. And then we're getting towards the end. A phantom is a receiver of light. It has such volume that light illuminates it, whereas a specter is radiating. It projects light. It shreds through other things through its light. So receiving light, projecting light. The one is a sponge, the other a brush. So if you use a sponge, it's basically working with you by absorbing the water and helping you to wash something, where a brush uses its spindly, sharp edges to get things off. So that would be another way that Dalí has contrasted it. And then finally, I think this is the last one, a phantom is a silhouette of anxiety that is opaque, voluminous, and spongy, whereas a specter is anxiety that's luminous, ruffled, and incandescent. And I just didn't want to cheat you of this fine language that Dalí shares in his article. I think that's really essential to getting into Dalí's mind about what he's thinking here, because he does have two very different ideas about what these are, and what he's partially arguing for is that the time of phantoms is about to end, and it seems that spectral ghosts are going to replace them. And indeed, that's what happens in his paintings. So it also is a bit like Dalí's obsession with the contrast between soft and hard objects. Soft objects are more like phantoms. They're billowy, they're plump, where hard morphology is like skeletal morphology. It's something that's ossified and bone-like. So just spending a little more time looking at a couple images, we're going to start with phantoms. This is the perfect example of a phantom in Dalí's world, a substantial figure wrapped in a sheet, a shoe on the head. So that was the photo of Dalí standing with the sheet, holding, there's a one with the shoe on his head, another with a stick on his head. But that's what he's thinking of as a phantom, so it seems to be connected to the sheets. The nursemaid in question here on the beach, sitting in the water, a boiled potato, Messonier's Napoleon at the head of a cavalcade, La Gioconda or the Mona Lisa. These are things Dalí thinks of as phantoms. And this is the woman who did the contrast between Picasso and Dalí, Astrid Rufa. She says that phantoms are obese bodies whose volume allows for the realization of the irrational. The prototype is the Hitlerian wet nurse, which is often how this is referred to, seated on the beach, immobile, immense, a tender back, rounded and nourishing. So plump, juicy, full of fruit, and totally still creepy, somehow or another creating anxiety through that. Here's a sheet that does not seem to have kind of the volume, but still would be thought of as a phantom in the landscape, figure with drapery. And then another one that seems very appropriate to this is this young woman holding a skull, which has become very much like a phantom, a very plump, juicy kind of skull that is mobile and can be done with things, can be molded in different ways. And then the transition to specter works really beautifully with this particular painting, which is in Osaka. This painting is called The Spectre and the Phantom. And at first you look at it and you see only one figure, but what we're seeing is a figure planted in water with a cypress tree off to the side. We have the small wall. Up above is this amazing and extraordinary cloud, and then a little rainbow. And the way that this transition works is explained here by one of Dalí's scholars, Chaim Finkelstein. He says the opposition between the volume of the nursemaid, so phantom, and the ephemeral virtuality of the rainbow, so the spectral part here is the rainbow, echoes the opposition between the phantom-like cloud, so again, voluminous, puffy, full of volume, and the spectral cypress tree. So the cypress tree and the rainbow are spectral, the large woman with the cloud up above are phantoms. Which moves us into the spectral area and where Dalí really moves forward in this period of time. So according to Dalí, he says, spectral representations are like the very large anthropomorphic skull, blindingly white, mad, sodomizing with its clear jaw a ruined grand piano, all of this taking place in the bright sunlight behind the old tarred black boat, abandoned on a deserted and ill-equipped beach, on top of which are some sparrows. So he's thinking very particularly about this, and this comes from the article. And then again, returning to Astrid Rufa, she says that this particular image, this is a specter. This is the ghost that replaces the phantom. It is visceral, it's aerodynamic, so again, movement, speed. It is a cannibal figure with soft parts that mark a violent eroticism. So the prime example is this painting with the bony, disjointed figure without clothes, bowed, fossil, and partially limp. So it's like an amalgamation of stuff, putrefying things that are just put together and can be recombined in different ways. And this is what Dalí delights in when he talks about spectral sex appeal. So when we look at some of the other images that share this kind of formation, these kind of ghosts or specters, as Dalí's referring to them, the Javanese mannequin, which was one of Reynolds Morse's absolute favorite paintings in our collection, is a perfect example of a specter. You have this strange and horrific combination of what appears to be a ship hull replacing the skeletal structure upon this very strange discombobulated torso where the butts have become elongated, and then it's rotting on this little piece of meat. It's all very disgusting, horrifying, and at the same time painted with such precision, it also is haunting and powerful. So it's cutting both ways. We move on. This is called the Night of Death. It doesn't have the word specter, but Dalí describes it as an iridescent specter accompanied by a rainbow. So it appears over and over again that the kind of skeletal structure represents specters, where the kind of shrouded, Beauclerk kind of ghost-like figure is a phantom. We move forward, and here is perhaps my favorite part about what Dalí does. He says, know amongst your friends which is the phantom and which is the specter. You know, pay attention. You know, there are some very distinct ways to understand this. And then Dalí gives us this list, which is truly strange. You know, the difference between Freud and Picasso, I can't quite get it. I don't see how Picasso is more spectral-like, where Freud is a phantom. Makes a little bit of sense. Greta Garbo, okay, that seems phantom-like. She's kind of plumpy and juicy and salacious, where Harpo Marx, quick-witted, quick-moving, kind of animalistic. He seems more spectral, but I don't know. Anyway, so we got Freud versus Picasso, de Chirico versus Gala, Dalí's wife, Greta Garbo versus Harpo Marx, and finally the Mona Lisa versus Marcel Duchamp, who I guess kind of transforms the Mona Lisa, and that's how he shreds it. So let's move a little bit past that obsession with ghosts, and we're going to look at the ghosts of Millay. Dalí has an obsession with the Angelus painting, and he says, Jean-Francois Millay, the inadvertent painter of the most important phantoms. So I think by calling them phantoms, I think he's particularly referring to the way that the female figure is like his nanny, Dalí's nursemaid. She seems voluminous, she's hidden by the clothing she's wearing, and there's also a sack of potatoes over here, which sort of reinforces that idea of a voluminous space. I would argue, though, that very quickly Dalí turns them into specters. Here there's certainly phantoms, and this is part of the La Chance de Maldeor, so they are ghosts-like in a more traditional way, sheets that just happen to resemble, skulls. But then by this point, I think we've moved from the female may still be phantom-like, but certainly the gentleman has become spectral. He is long gone for this world. He has been munched on and cannibalized, and he is no longer part of our world. But she might not be part of our world either. I guess both of them have moved on to that twilight, as it says. Atavism's at twilight. And then here, the specter of the Angelus. So here, very clearly, the Angelus female figure has become that insect. Dalí compares to the praying mantis, which in captivity, the praying mantis will devour its mate in the process of mating. So Dalí is fascinated by this, and it's spooky, it's horrifying, it's kind of the femme fatale, succubus kind of themes. And of course, the one thing I probably should mention right at the very beginning, Dalí, as well as his colleagues in Surrealism, they are all the last vestige of Romanticism. They may be in the 20th century, they may be involved with the modern world, but they are all living in the 19th century, the world of drama and craziness, and from Jericho on down, that's who they're drawing from. So these kind of interpretations fit very well with late symbolism. And then we move from Millay. So Millay has become a specter. Now Vermeer becomes a specter, Dalí's hero, his favorite artist. And hopefully you're all familiar with the allegory of painting, which is just this remarkable painting by Vermeer showing the artist in his studio. Looks photographic, had a great deal of influence on the way that Dalí chose to paint a lot of his works. And then, of course, Vermeer becomes a character in Dalí's paintings. He becomes the ghost of Vermeer. So he is long gone, but he comes back. He is haunting our landscape. And the type of ghost he is, I think, is really a specter. He even has the disconnected foot so that they are disassembling and reassembling themselves in different ways. And he's become a table conveniently for our use. So Dalí is very, very kind this way. Here's one that you probably have not seen. This is the ghost of Vermeer of Delft. Again, very spectral. The head has also become something that seems to be sewn up and opening, and it's supported by the crutch. And there seems to be a phantom-like appearance right back here, very much from Boclean under that moon. And the cypress tree is present, which makes it spectral. This painting, where Vermeer seems very much alive and active, the enigmatic elements in the landscape, when we look at what those elements in the landscape are, we can see it's, once again, very, very spectral. We have one of those creatures again, like we saw in the Boclean variation a little bit earlier. There's cypress trees. There's a haunted sort of tower. And then there's two very large beings in the background that seem to be engaged in a sort of yin and yang type of symbol. And of course, a little detail of Dalí and his nurse, the phantom, seated here on this open plain. So all of these items keep coming back in different variations during this 3-year period. I'm not sure. I think you're very right that there are very different types of cloud formations happening here. And I'm not sure if I would refer to them that way, but it sounds good. I mean, they do seem very sharp, I would say this is consistent with the other one that Dalí described as a phantom-like, cloud. So I think you're right. This is more like a spectral slicing of clouds, or a cloud that would be able to slice. Two other really curious ones, and then we're going to move into a slightly different period. These are also specters. This one's from a private collection in 34, and it is, again, a kind of phantom visiting a specter who happens to have the head full of roses. So we've seen the head full of roses before. You could argue that they are also an extension of the kind of phantom-like experience where the female figures suddenly blossom into heads of roses and they haunt the landscapes in the way that these phantoms and specters did. And then last but not least, this aerodynamic specter. This is the specter of Vermeer of Delft, where he has clearly become one with the cypress tree, which is piercing his belly, coming right out. And then Gala, who has not quite noticed what's happening yet up here, looking quite a bit like the vessel right next to her. So I don't know if she represents a phantom at this point. It's not clear, but there are strange things happening in this painting. Which brings us to the transition to the next group of ghosts. So we've talked a lot about specters. We talked a little bit about phantoms. The other group that is really absolutely fascinating in a very different way are these apparition paintings. And there's about 5 or 6 of them Dalí does over this period of time. The first one seems to be 1933, The Phantom Cart. And when we're looking at this is happening, he's painting these around the same period of time. And the Phantom Cart is probably one of Dalí's most successful double images. And, well, no, let me rephrase that. This is the most successful early double image Dalí created, the one that really worked exactly like he wanted it to. And we look at it and we see a cart moving back into the landscape. And yet when you look close, you realize, is there a cart? Are we looking at something that's really there? Or are we looking at 2 tops of buildings rather than 2 people in the cart that are actually in the pack? And are these 2 just actually not wheels, but posts along the road that leads us into the town? You know, is there a cart here, or is it a hallucination that we just happen to be encountering because it's a very dry day under this? Well, that part I think is the mystery. It's like, what is that? Is that really there? Is it not? What are we looking at? But it's definitely undermines the idea that there's anyone in the cart or that there's even wheels on this cart moving through space. So it's very much haunted. It's very appropriate to call it the Phantom Cart. This is a very curious and very powerful image by Dalí of his wife with 2 gentlemen who were known to be mad. They definitely suffered from a particular kind of madness, which eventually wound up institutionalizing them. They were 2 of the fishermen in Port Legat that Dalí knew. And they're holding something very important for these apparitional paintings. They're holding an amphora, this kind of either Phoenician or Roman vessel that's broken, but you would find this on any beach, you know, back in the 1920s, 19-teens, something that washed up but from Phoenician times. So it's an old ruin, and they're using it, and very quickly Dalí turns it into a figure in this particular painting, the fine and average invisible harp. You can see the 2 fishermen are still there. They're still holding the amphora, but Gala has moved on. She's lost her pants somewhere along the way, and she's moving on. And the gentleman who's in the front seems to be, maybe he's devouring her trousers, we're not sure, but there's something coming out of his mouth. I think I've got a detail, there you go. You can see it a little bit better. And you can see that something very wild and very unsettling has happened to his poor skull. So, you know, it's both become very alive in a kind of phallic way, but yet it's supported by a crutch, so it would tumble without that. And here's one of these sheet-like forms like we saw earlier in the talk. So Dalí is using very familiar images to start haunting his paintings. And that's when we arrive at these paintings, and there's about 4 of them I'm going to show you. This one's called the mediumistic paranoid image. And this painting looks so different from any of those spectral images we just saw because it looks like a photograph. It looks like it just happens to be a hand-tinted photograph of something you'd encounter. But then you start looking at them, and everything seems rather arbitrary about it. You see that there's 2 gentlemen working on the bottom right. They seem to be doing something, and they're acknowledging us in the space. They're not casting a shadow. Very, very far in the background, there's a bicycle rider who doesn't seem to be engaged with anything happening. And then there's a woman that just happens to be sitting over here, also in some water, sort of like Dalí's nanny, who also doesn't seem to, well, she's casting a shadow going this way, which is different than the shadows cast by these gentlemen. So it's like they happen to be there at different periods of time. So the sun's not the same from painting to painting. And then we notice, of course, right in the foreground, there's that pink amphora. And it's almost like what Dalí's doing is he's giving us this, what he calls a mediumistic image. So again, we're returning to spiritualism and the idea of the medium who can bring back the dead. And we're looking at photos probably collected from different scrapbooks Dalí had that are just visionary apparitions appearing before us on this beach. So the beach becomes a place where they're projected, and we start to realize that it's a projection and not real because of the presence of the amphora. And you'll see what I mean when we go to the next image. So this is the sun table. Clearly not an image you would expect to, or a scene you would expect to encounter on the beach. There's a table here. There's a little area of tiles underneath it, patterned tiles. We have 3 glasses here with spoons, probably absinthe of some sort. And then, of course, there's a camel out here with a rider on it that appears to be right next to a column. There's a couple boats by no beach at all. And then this black shadowed figure, and of course right here, there's the amphora. So it's almost like the projection, like a hallucination we're experiencing in daylight. The next piece from 1 year later, the same thing. This is called White Calm. We see a woman in the water. We see another gentleman in the water far, far behind her. Seems like the perspective is very strange there. And then there's this very spooky kind of scarecrow-like character standing on a rock with a pitchfork, reminding us of the Angelus couple that just also happens to be there at the same time. And then an amphora right in the foreground. Same amphora each time. It's like this haunting vision that keeps reoccurring. And the last place that we have it is in this paranoid astral image from 1936. So this has been 3 years now. And we have the amphora here. We have an image of Dalí's father here, and you can see the shadow he casts is very strong and goes off to the right. This is Dalí in a boat with a woman that we don't know who she is, casting a very different shadow on no water whatsoever. So it's this like landlocked boat that Dalí just happens to be sitting with this elegant woman. And then there's this rather strange little woman in the back that seems to be drifting through, and we have the amphora in the foreground. The shadows are not consistent with these three groups of people. His shadow is very long. Her shadow is almost like from the sun being straight up. And you can see that there's a piece of silk here, this fabric, that seems to be flying or floating off his hat, which is going in a different direction than the air that's blowing her silk scarf, which is going that way. So it really does feel like you're having this vision, one moment in time of three different times, and the amphora is kind of winking to us that this is a vision, it's not real. You're not in a real place.
That piece of silk that you described, it looks like one of those spectral figures that figure in a lot of Dalí.
It's true. Yeah, there's a lot of borrowing and going back and forth with these images. Yeah, it is his father. It's described as his father. But the figure that I'm going to talk about now, just moving us to the end of the talk, is the figure right in the center. She's a ghost, as all these images are, but she's a very particular ghost. This is the ghost of Dalí's cousin, Carolineta. She appears in a number of paintings in the same way the amphora appears in a number of paintings. She was a Carolineta Barnadas Ferres, so Dalí's aunt, not really his cousin, but he referred to her as his cousin. She was a 34-year-old spinster who died from meningitis when Dalí was 10 years old. She was not part of the immediate family, but somebody that Dalí loved very much. He remembered her. And when it was announced at the family house, where there were many, many people living with Dalí, there was his grandmother, his mother, his sister, the maids, all of these people. When it was announced that she had passed, there was just a horrendous kind of wailing for the weekend of people, just caught off guard, and kind of a tumultuous experience of having lost somebody they all cared for. When Dalí is in the 1930s, when he's about 30 years old, she suddenly starts to haunt the paintings again. So just real quickly, here's one from 1934, The Apparition of My Cousin Carolineta on the Beach at Roses. Again, there's the amphora in the foreground. We have The Apparition of My Cousin Carolineta, also on the Beach of Roses, a different painting. Here we don't have the amphora, but she has become one with the cypress tree, so it's almost as if she's become spectral. Here's one where she has merged in with the phantom cart, the moment of transition from 1934. She's here in the background, and the cart illusion is over here to the right. And then even in our own morphological echo upstairs from 1936, she's the figure right here, and you can see it up more closely. And this whole painting is about how visionary apparitions can happen to Dalí, and he's kind of cluing us in that the figure of the grapes looks very much like the figure laying down, which resembles very much the wall in the background. They all have a similar shape, but they mean completely different things. But in Dalí's mind, they can transition one to the other. And then in Forgotten Horizon from the Tate Museum, you have these very curious ballerinas, but of course, in the background, there's the haunting ghost of Carolineta. And then what I would argue is that somewhere around 1935, cousin Carolineta starts to become the girl skipping rope. She's another apparition, another thing that suddenly does not make sense, because you see the bell tower back here has exactly the same shape as the girl skipping rope here. And that was the bell tower on Dalí's sister's school that he remembered from childhood. He remembered how much it resembled a girl skipping rope. At this point in 1935, she starts appearing to haunt the canvas, to have that same sort of uncomfortable, uncanny sort of presence. And then finally, so what happens? Why does all of this end? Where does this go? Why do we not associate ghosts with Dalí's work, after the 1930s? Well, the main thing that seems to change everything is the war. Not only World War II, but in particular the Spanish Civil War. When the Spanish Civil War unleashes, ghosts and hauntings and that kind of uncanny experience seems to be replaced by something much more real, much more visceral, much more horrifying. And images that start to appear in Dalí's work are also much more visceral and horrifying. Dalí says that according to Nostradamus, the medium who could predict the future, the apparition of monsters presages the outbreak of war. The canvas has a prophetic character issue. And certainly soft construction with boiled beans, which was later added on the title Premonition of Civil War, was painted just before the war broke out. And then once the war broke out, Dalí renames it with this idea. But it's one of the most horrific and powerful images Dalí ever painted. It owes a lot to the specters that he had painted up until this point, but it's a much more monstrous, much more horrifying vision. And it really aligns with a different period of Goya, which is Goya's black paintings, and particularly Saturn devouring his son. That kind of painful, just excruciating horror is something very different than the kind of hauntings that we saw up until this point. Another painting that's a little bit more light, but at the same time super creepy, is the painting in the Art Institute of Chicago called The Invention of Monsters. And what Dalí has done here is he's noticed that by using a Picasso device of showing a profile and a silhouette of a face, he can double a form. And so, for example, Dalí and Gala are one character right down here. You can see Dalí's looking at us, Gala's looking to the side. Together they become sort of monstrous. He calls it a sentimental monstrous figure with the two of them, but it's monstrous. And then we have a Da Vinci character, so looking out and looking to the side, that have become together. And then we have women and horses that come together as these sort of monstrous centaurs in the water. There's a curious sort of angel cat, I guess would be the way that Dalí described it. You can see a cat face here with angel wings. And apparently Dalí says that's an angel monster. The burning giraffe back here represents the horror of the moment. And the thing that it's always good to point out, but has nothing to do with what we're talking about other than maybe fulfilling it, over here you can see the slightest halo of a shape. There was actually a little dog, a little blue dog that was part of this painting when Dalí originally painted it. He used a very fugitive paint. It wasn't a good paint. And over time, it's just absorbed and disappeared. So curiously, there is actually an absent character that was part of the original canvas that seems monstrous that it's stolen from it, so seems appropriate. Dalí's own self-portrait, The Metamorphosis of Narcissus, another one of these monstrous creatures. This is definitely spectral, but it's moved on into something more horrific and maybe more personal. Doesn't quite feel like a haunting vision as much as an impossibly unsettling vision. And the Endless Enigma, which we've not been able to have here, but the shape right in the center, Dalí refers to as the one-eyed monster. And you can see the two eyes, the nose, and the lips. It's one of these very elaborate double image paintings, but the particular image in the middle, Dalí refers to as a monster. And then, of course, nothing is more monstrous than this last painting referring to Guernica, which is the debris of an automobile giving birth to a blind horse biting a telephone. It's absurd, it's crazy, it's way over the top, it's goofy, and at the same time, it's monstrous for sure. And then what I would argue is that all of this sort of disappears when Dalí comes to the United States. He still draws on a lot of the ideas. He's still sort of that macabre artist. He's still the one who slices eyeballs. But somehow or another, the hauntings and the ghosts and the ephemera of the mid-30s sort of disappears to something much more classical. And so suddenly we have Catholic mythology, we have crucifixions, we have Madonnas, we have all these images that are very much at odds with the world of ghosts and goblins and specters and phantoms and all of these things that were part of Dalí's 1930s paintings. So by the American period of the 1940s, it seems like Dalí has moved on even past a lot of his monstrous images at the end of the 1930s. So just to briefly recap what we talked about, Dalí has an interest in the macabre, which leads to his interest in both Spanish and Surrealist images related to ghosts. The mid-1930s, from about 1933 to 1936, is Dalí's period of ghosts, and that eventually gets bifurcated into phantoms and specters. Soon, his own cousin becomes one of these ghost-like creatures that haunts his works. And then finally, with the breakout of the Spanish Civil War, times change, Dalí changes, and things have moved on to eventually his embracing of Raphael and the Renaissance and a kind of call to order and reason, something very much at odds with these kind of haunting images that we saw through the 1930s. So with that, hopefully you have a little bit better arm to go upstairs, maybe explore some of Dalí's Surrealist paintings on your own and maybe see a few things you did not realize were part of Dalí's world. But hopefully this was fun. Thank you all for coming out today. And if you have any questions or whatever, I'm happy to answer them up here